Out here in Wyoming's Wind River Range, dawn doesn't break gently. It cuts through the night like a blade, cold and unyielding. Dr. Madison Lee woke to the bite of that chill, exhaled into her tent, and watched her breath swirl before her eyes. For 3 weeks, she'd lived in these wild lands, alone except for the buzz of insects and the distant haunting calls of coyotes. She pulled on her field jacket, laced her boots tight, and checked her camera gear with hands that shook. Not from cold, but anticipation. People in town called her stubborn, idealistic, maybe even a little crazy. A woman in her late 20s, out here alone, studying wild Mustangs when she could have been teaching at a university or running some cozy lab. But nothing in her academic life ever compared to watching these horses in the raw, untamed wild, tracking them from ridge to ridge, learning their secret language of flicking ears and pounding hooves. Madison's goal was as ambitious as it was personal. She wanted to document the behavior of Mustangs, especially the legendary black stallion the locals called Thunder. Old ranchers scoffed at stories about Thunder, a horse too clever for cowboys, too wild for fences, rumored to leap rivers and outsmart wolves. Madison believed every word. She trekked out before sunrise, boots crunching over frost-hardened grass, binoculars slung around her neck, every sense tuned to the wilderness. The mountains loomed on all sides, vast and indifferent. For hours, she scanned the hillsides, searching for movement, until finally, near a granite outcrop, she spotted them. Thunder and his herd, grazing in the open, their breath steaming in the cold morning air. Thunder was unmistakable, jet black from mane to tail, scars like lightning bolts slashing his flank, his stance alert and watchful. Madison crouched behind a stand of juniper, raising her camera with trembling hands, trying to steady herself. She whispered into her voice recorder, narrating every detail. The herd moved with a fluid, silent unity, mares and foals clustering around Thunder as he led them across a grassy clearing. Then, out of nowhere, the world changed. Madison's body tensed as a distant yelp shattered the silence. Wolves, their cries echoing across the canyon. She scanned the tree line, heart in her throat, as 4 shadows darted into the open, gray and lean, their eyes fixed on the horses. Thunder snorted, reared, and stamped the earth, signaling the herd to run. Chaos erupted. Mustangs bolted in all directions, hooves thundering, foals stumbling behind their mothers. Madison ducked lower, camera rolling, her breath catching. She knew this was the moment she'd waited for, but fear gripped her. The wolves worked as one, splitting off Thunder from his herd, snapping at his heels, driving him away from the others. Madison felt her heart hammer in her chest as she watched, helpless. The black stallion spun, wheeled, dodged. He was fast, but the wolves were relentless, nipping at his legs, harrying him toward the edge of the plateau. It was then that Madison noticed the terrain. Just beyond Thunder, a sheer 50-foot drop to the river below, white water roaring over jagged rocks. She realized with horror what was happening. The wolves were herding him, using the cliff as a trap. If he kept running, he'd have nowhere to go. She glanced at her camera, still filming, but her hands shook so badly the lens wobbled. For a split second, she thought about stepping out, shouting, doing something, anything. Then she remembered her purpose. She was here to observe, not interfere, but the line blurred when life and death hung in the balance right before her eyes. Thunder came to a skidding halt at the cliff's edge, his flanks heaving, his eyes wild. The wolves fanned out behind him, tongues lolling, circling for the kill. Madison froze. She could barely breathe. The air crackled with tension. She could hear her own heartbeat, the wolves' growls, the river's fury below. For an agonizing moment, time seemed to stop. Thunder looked back, no escape. He pawed the ground, nostrils flaring, as the wolves crept closer, snapping their jaws. Madison's mind screamed at him to run, to fight, to do anything but fall. She lifted her camera, barely able to hold it steady. Suddenly, with a burst of desperate energy, Thunder did the unthinkable. He reared, hooves flailing, then bolted forward, not away from the edge, but straight toward it. The wolves lunged after him, but it was too late. In one impossible motion, Thunder leaped, over the lip of the cliff, out into empty air. Madison gasped. Her camera caught every second, as Thunder seemed to hang suspended above the churning river, his mane streaming, muscles straining, a living shadow against the rising sun. Then he vanished, plunging into the spray and foam below. The wolves skidded to a halt at the cliff's edge, howling in frustration, unable to follow. Madison collapsed to her knees, the adrenaline coursing through her, hands clenched so tight around her camera, she thought she might break it. For several long moments, she waited, barely daring to breathe. She peered over the rocks, desperate for any sign of movement in the frothing water below. The wilderness was silent again, except for the river's roar and the distant fading howls of the wolves. In that instant, Madison realized she had witnessed something extraordinary, something wild and true that few people would ever believe. She hugged her camera to her chest, shaking with fear, awe, and a raw electric sense of wonder. She whispered to herself, her voice trembling, "Did you see that? Did you really see that?" The edge of survival, she thought, was razor thin. Out here in the heart of the wild, anything could happen. The world seemed to freeze as Thunder vanished into the thundering mist below. For a heartbeat, Madison couldn't move. Her camera poised, breath shallow, a cold sweat prickling her brow. The wolves lingered at the cliff's edge, hackles raised, peering down with wild frustration. They paced, sniffed, and yowled, their hunt thwarted by a stallion's impossible choice. Madison's pulse drummed in her ears, each second stretching into eternity. What had she just witnessed? Was Thunder lost for good? With trembling hands, she scrambled closer to the cliff, heart racing. The sheer drop was dizzying. Jagged rocks lined the base, the river a torrent of white foam and swirling debris. She focused her camera down, zooming through the thick mist, desperate to spot any sign of life. The river below looked merciless, ready to swallow anything that dared challenge its rage. She pressed her back to the cold rock, forcing herself to steady her breathing. "Come on, Thunder. Come on," Madison whispered, half in prayer, half in denial. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing moved below. No black shape, no ripple out of place. The wolves retreated, slinking into the trees, defeated but hungry, their eerie howls fading into the dawn. Suddenly, a ripple split the river's surface. Madison leaned forward, nearly losing her footing. There, a dark shape surged upward through the foam, breaking the surface with a gasp of spray and a flash of wild eyes. Thunder! The stallion's head broke through the water, his mane plastered to his neck, blood streaking his flank from where he'd scraped the rocks. But he was alive, fighting, swimming, lungs burning, refusing to give up. Madison's whole body sagged in relief. She refocused the camera, zooming in as Thunder thrashed his way to the riverbank. The shore on this side was a nightmare. Rocks slick with moss, brush thick and tangled, barely any room to climb. But the far side was even worse. Steeper, sheer cliffs that rose back toward the plateau. Thunder was trapped between the river and the wild, battered stone. The wolves, regrouped above, circled along the rim, hoping he'd be swept back out. But Thunder, battered and limping, pressed forward. His chest heaved as he searched for a foothold, hooves scraping against the rock, water streaming from his coat. Madison caught every second, her lens trembling, heart thundering in her chest to match his struggle. He tried once, twice, slipping each time, crashing back into the icy current. Madison swallowed hard, eyes stinging. She wanted to help him, to shout encouragement. But all she could do was watch. The river raged around him, and still Thunder fought. He turned, searching for a better route, finally finding a narrow ledge barely wide enough for his hooves. With a last desperate surge, Thunder pulled himself up, scrambling onto the rocks, nostrils flaring, flanks heaving. Blood trickled down his legs, but he didn't pause. He staggered up the bank, away from the river's edge, every step a miracle of willpower. For a second, he stood atop the stones, silhouetted against the rising sun, a black specter above the roaring white water. Madison's camera caught the moment Thunder threw his head back and let out a call, wild, triumphant, raw. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, ringing above the river and into the empty sky. It was a challenge, a warning, a cry of survival. The wolves above froze, their bodies tense, listening. Even Madison felt chills run down her spine. Thunder's call faded into the hush, but its meaning lingered. He was not beaten, not broken. Somehow, against all odds, he had survived. Madison realized she was crying, her cheeks wet with tears she hadn't noticed falling. She backed away from the cliff, sinking to her knees, her camera pressed tight against her chest. The adrenaline rush ebbed, leaving her exhausted and trembling. She stared at the screen on her camera, replaying the footage over and over. The leap, the fall, the impossible swim. Every frame burned into her mind, proof that something extraordinary had happened. For a scientist, this was a once-in-a-lifetime event, a story that would reshape what people thought they knew about wild horses, about courage, about the instinct to survive. Madison glanced back at the rim, where the wolves now drifted away, defeated. The herd, scattered during the attack, was nowhere in sight. Thunder was alone on the far shore, battered and bleeding, but alive. He limped into the brush, head low, searching for shelter, still a leader, still a legend. Madison took a deep, shaking breath, rising to her feet. She was keenly aware of the fine line she walked out here, the line between observer and participant, between telling the story and being changed by it. Today, she'd crossed that line in her heart. She'd seen the raw, unfiltered struggle for survival, the grit and intelligence it took to make the leap. She slung her camera back over her shoulder and started the long, winding hike back to her camp. Every muscle ached, her mind reeling with what she'd witnessed. The light was brighter now, the world alive with possibility. She knew this footage would change everything, if only people would believe her. She cast one last look at the canyon before heading back through the pines, vowing to honor the leap she'd seen, and the wild spirit of Thunder who had refused to be broken. The legend she knew was real, and she was now its keeper. Madison's boots crunched on the frost-bitten grass as she trudged back to her camp. Her hands still shook, knuckles pale where she gripped the camera strap. Her heart felt battered, just like Thunder, the images replaying in her mind with cinematic clarity. The impossible leap, the plunge, the struggle in the roaring river, and the wild, victorious cry that had echoed through the canyon. She kept glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the wolves at her back. But the world was strangely quiet. The sun had risen fully now, turning the high peaks gold and casting long blue shadows over the endless Wyoming wilderness. Back at her small campsite, a battered canvas tent, a folding chair, and a makeshift table of flat stones, Madison dropped her pack and sank into the chair. She reached for her field journal with hands that still trembled, flipped to a fresh page and began scribbling furiously. 6:07 a.m. witnessed black stallion, thunder, separated from herd by wolfpack attack. Cliff, approx. 50 feet. Wolves coordinated to drive stallion to river's edge. Subject made leap, recorded on camera. Stallion survived fall, swam to inaccessible shoreline, injured but ambulatory. Wolves unable to follow. Subject called out. Behavior consistent with stress and assertion of dominance. She forced herself to pause, to breathe, to replay the footage frame by frame on the tiny screen of her camera. Every detail mattered. This wasn't just a story. This was science, and she knew that every word, every second of video could make the difference between being dismissed as another crazy horse lady and being taken seriously by the world. She copied her video files to 3 separate drives, labeling each with the date, time, and coordinates. This was the routine she'd developed in the field. Back up everything, trust nothing to chance. It was part discipline, part paranoia, born from too many stories of lost footage and missed opportunities. When she was done, Madison reached for her binoculars and hiked up the rocky outcrop near her camp, scanning the wide valley below. The Mustangs were nowhere to be seen at first, the open space eerily empty. She swept the landscape, heart heavy with worry. Had Thunder's herd escaped? Had the foals made it through the chaos? Where was Thunder now? Then, at the edge of a thicket by the river, she spotted movement. Brown, white, and gray bodies clustered together, nervous and tight. The Mustangs. Madison adjusted the focus, searching for the black stallion. For a long moment, she saw only mares and young colts, their ears flicking, tails swishing as they looked anxiously back and forth. Finally, she saw him. Thunder, moving slowly, limping, his coat slick with water, streaks of blood tracing his hind leg. He paused at the edge of the thicket, his body language cautious and uncertain. The herd reacted with wariness, some of the mares sidestepping, foals edging closer to their mothers. Thunder stood still, head low, as if waiting for permission to approach. Madison held her breath, watching this silent negotiation unfold. The herd's lead mare, an older gray Madison had dubbed Willow, stepped forward, nostrils flaring. She circled Thunder slowly, eyeing his injuries, then touched noses with him, an ancient equine greeting, wary but not unfriendly. One by one, the other mares followed suit, until the herd's tight, defensive circle loosened, and Thunder was welcomed back into their midst. He didn't try to reassert his dominance with bluster or violence. Instead, Thunder moved quietly, letting the others approach, accepting their cautious nuzzles and sidelong glances. Madison felt a strange ache in her chest as she watched. Here was leadership that didn't come from brute strength, but from wisdom, from endurance, from having survived what no other horse had ever survived. She watched as Thunder settled in among his herd, lying down in the grass for the first time, the foals coming closer, curiosity overtaking their fear. Willow grazed nearby, keeping a protective eye on the stallion. The rest of the herd relaxed, tension dissolving with the sunlight. Life, against all odds, continued. Madison wrote more notes, her handwriting sloppier now as exhaustion crept in. She tried to capture not just the facts, but the feeling, the intangible, electric moment of survival and reunion. The way the herd's fear gave way to trust. The way Thunder's quiet resilience spoke more than any dramatic display ever could. The wilderness around her hummed with life. Birds called in the distance. A breeze rustled the aspens. Somewhere a chipmunk chattered from a pile of rocks. Madison sat quietly, feeling the boundaries between herself and the wild world dissolve a little more. She wasn't just observing anymore. She was part of the story, witness to the fragile, brutal, and beautiful balance of survival. Her mind drifted, replaying the events again and again. She wondered if she'd ever truly be able to explain it to someone who hadn't seen it. How fear and intelligence worked together in that desperate moment. How instinct and courage combined in a single leap that defied logic and expectation. By mid-morning, the sun was warm, the valley peaceful again, and Madison's exhaustion settled in deep. She scribbled one final thought in her journal. We study animals for what they can teach us, but sometimes, if we're lucky, they show us what it means to be brave, to adapt, to lead with more than just power. Today, Thunder taught me that survival isn't just about strength. It's about heart, about hope, about making the leap when the world gives you no other choice. Madison closed her journal and stared out across the wilderness, her resolve stronger than ever. She knew the days ahead would be hard, convincing others, facing doubt, maybe even risking her reputation. But she also knew this. She'd witnessed something real, something worth fighting for. Out here, in the silence, she felt herself changing, becoming as wild and determined as the horses she'd come to love. And somewhere, in the distance, a black stallion lifted his head to the sky, calling out to the wild, the survivor's song echoing across the endless, untamed land. By the time Madison rolled back into town, her truck rattling over gravel, she'd replayed the footage in her mind 100 times. Every bump in the road seemed to echo her anxiety. The thrill of discovery faded with each mile, replaced by a creeping uncertainty. Would anyone believe what she had seen? Would the scientific world respect the risk she'd taken, the pain she'd witnessed, the bond she'd felt with the wild? Or would they laugh her out of the room, just like the old cowboys in the cafe always did? She parked behind the little research office off Main Street, grabbed her backpack and hard drives, and headed inside. The place smelled of old paper, coffee, and cedar. It was quiet, except for the ticking clock on the wall and the hum of fluorescent lights. Dr. Harlan, her mentor and the head of the wildlife research program, was at his desk, reading an article with red pen in hand. He looked up when Madison entered, his gray brows arching. "Well, look who survived another week in the wild." She offered a shaky smile. "You have no idea." She wasted no time, pulling up the video footage on her laptop, her voice trembling with a mix of excitement and nerves. "Harlan, you need to see this. It's Thunder. He did something I've never seen before. The wolves, the cliff. Just watch." The video played in silence, the wild drama filling the room, while Madison watched Dr. Harlan's face, hoping for awe, maybe even a touch of pride. But as the footage ended, Thunder's leap, the plunge, the howl, the battered stallion climbing out, Dr. Harlan's lips tightened. "Madison, it's astonishing. But you realize what you're asking people to believe, don't you? A wild stallion, outsmarting wolves, surviving a 50-foot drop, and leading his herd again. It sounds like a legend, not research." He tapped the desk. "This is your reputation on the line. The department's too." She felt the sting of his words, but it happened. "I have the video, my notes, data from the GPS collar. Everything lines up." He leaned forward. "People will say it's fake or staged. There's precedent, hoaxes, doctored footage. I know you're not that kind of scientist, but you know how this looks, especially as a woman in this field. They'll come at you twice as hard." Madison swallowed, fighting a wave of frustration. "I'm not giving up, Harlan. I saw something real out there. Thunder isn't just a story. He's proof that these horses are smarter, braver, and more complex than anyone gives them credit for. He looked at her for a long time, eyes softening. Just be ready for a fight. She nodded, gathering her things, determination flaring. Always am. After leaving the office, Madison made her way to the small cafe on the edge of town. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business. She sat at the counter, ordered coffee, and tried to gather her thoughts. The bell jingled as townsfolk came and went. Ranchers, teachers, retirees with faces weathered by years of Wyoming sun. At a table near the window, a cluster of men laughed, their voices carrying. Madison recognized them, ranch hands from the Rourke property. One of them, a heavy-set guy with a big hat, caught sight of her and elbowed his buddy. "Hey, look, it's the horse whisperer," he called, grinning. "Find any unicorns out there, Doc?" Another chimed in. "Maybe next time she'll catch Bigfoot on camera, too. What do you think?" Madison tried to ignore them, but their laughter stung more than she wanted to admit. She stared into her coffee, her shoulders tightening. All the old stories about thunder. Just town gossip, they'd always said. A woman scientist, alone in the wild, chasing fairy tales. She finished her coffee and left without a word, but as she walked out into the bright afternoon, the doubts followed her like a shadow. Was Dr. Harlan right? Was she risking everything, her career, her credibility, on something the world wasn't ready to see? She wandered through town, past faded murals of cowboys and cattle, the air thick with the scent of pine and distant rain. She ended up at the old bridge overlooking the river, the same river Thunder had survived. She gripped the railing, closed her eyes, and listened to the water rushing below. In that moment, she remembered Thunder's leap, the raw courage, the wild intelligence, the way he had faced death with everything he had. She remembered the herd accepting him back, not because he was the biggest or strongest, but because he was theirs, and he had survived. Madison realized she couldn't back down, not now. She was tired of apologizing for caring too much, for believing in what she'd seen with her own eyes. The wolves, the leap, the battered stallion, they were all real. And if the world wanted to call her crazy, let them. She would tell the story anyway. That night, Madison sat in her cramped apartment, maps and field notes spread out across the kitchen table. She started compiling her comprehensive report, combining GPS data, video footage, behavioral logs, and her own detailed notes. She annotated every second of the footage, marked every injury on Thunder, cross-referenced wolfpack movement from her earlier surveys. She wrote with a fury she'd never known, driven by the memory of that wild leap and the sense of responsibility settling heavy on her shoulders. This wasn't just about science anymore. It was about proving to herself and to everyone else that the wild was still full of stories that mattered. She stayed up until dawn, fingers cramped, eyes burning. When she finished, she sat back, exhausted, and looked at what she'd created, a report that was more than data and video. It was a testimony to the power of the wild, to the courage of a stallion, to the stubbornness of a scientist who refused to look away. As the first light crept across her desk, Madison whispered, "If Thunder can survive that leap, so can I." Resolve replaced her doubt. As solid and unyielding as the mountains themselves, the sprawling convention center was buzzing with excitement as scientists, researchers, and wildlife enthusiasts from across the country gathered for the annual Rocky Mountain Wildlife Conference. Madison felt a tremor of nerves as she stepped into the crowded lobby, her report and hard drives clutched tightly in her messenger bag. The memory of Thunder's leap burned in her mind, vivid and urgent, fueling both her courage and her fear. This was it. The moment she would put everything on the line. Her invitation had come unexpectedly, a terse email after she'd sent her initial report to the Wildlife Research Board. Now she found herself standing in front of a massive schedule board, her name wedged between presentations on elk migration patterns and the latest in grizzly bear tracking technology. Documenting wild Mustang behavior, new findings from the Wind River Range, the title read. Underneath, in smaller print, Dr. Madison Lee, Wind River Research Initiative. The lecture hall was already packed when Madison entered, people lining up along the walls and crowding the aisles. She recognized faces from her graduate school days, others from distant conferences, and still more she'd only read about in journals. As she set up her laptop and connected to the projector, a ripple of anticipation ran through the room. Was it excitement or skepticism? The senior panelists, 3 men and 1 woman, all veterans in the field, sat at the front, clipboards in hand. Madison could feel their eyes on her, weighing, measuring, doubting. She caught Dr. Harlan's gaze in the audience, his nod barely perceptible, a silent show of support. The moderator's voice rang out. Our next speaker is Dr. Madison Lee, presenting her findings on wild Mustang behavior in Wyoming's Wind River Range. Madison took a deep breath and began. She described her methodology: solo observation, GPS tracking, camera traps, and months of data. The audience listened in polite silence, but she could sense their restlessness, their unspoken questions. Then she brought up the video. Thunder's leap. The room darkened, the screen flickered, and the wild Wyoming dawn filled the hall. As Thunder faced down the wolves and made his impossible jump, a collective gasp swept through the audience. Whispers followed. Disbelief, awe, suspicion. Some leaned forward, others crossed their arms defensively. When the lights came back up, the questions began, fast, sharp, relentless. Dr. Lee, how do you explain a stallion surviving a 50-foot fall into a rapid river? Are you sure your footage hasn't been manipulated? Another panelist pressed, this footage is extraordinary, but can you verify its authenticity? Has it been reviewed by a third party? A man in the back raised his voice. With respect, Dr. Lee, isn't it more likely this was staged or the product of a trick of the camera? Horses don't behave this way, at least not according to the literature. Madison felt heat rising in her face. She steadied herself, answered each question with calm precision. The footage is time-stamped, with GPS data matching my field logs and the satellite data. I've provided unedited raw files to the board for review. I have over 70 hours of observational footage documenting Thunder and his herd. Every incident logged, every behavioral note cross-referenced. She presented graphs and charts of wolfpack movements, maps of Mustang ranges, even heart rate readings from Thunder's earlier GPS collaring. The evidence was solid, but the skepticism remained, thinly veiled behind academic language. Then came the undercurrent she'd feared. A senior scientist with a clipped accent spoke up. Dr. Lee, these are bold claims. Some would say, reckless. And you must understand, the burden is higher when such claims come from someone less established. The implication was clear. Madison felt the sting, not just as a young scientist, but as a woman in a field still ruled by old assumptions. She saw some audience members exchange glances, a few shaking their heads, but she refused to shrink. She pressed on, voice unwavering. The wild doesn't always conform to our expectations. I was out there alone every day, in conditions most people only read about. Thunder's leap wasn't a trick. It was survival. And I have the data, the context, and the supporting evidence to prove it. A hush fell over the room. The panelists consulted in low voices. Then the moderator addressed her. "We will need time to review your footage and supporting material, but this is quite a story." As the session ended, a knot of scientists approached her, some skeptical, some curious, a few quietly supportive. Dr. Patel, a respected behavioral ecologist, shook her hand. "Whatever the outcome, you made people pay attention. That's how the field changes, Dr. Lee." In the corridor, a few others cornered her, their questions sharper, their disbelief more personal. "You're risking your whole career on a horse story. Why?" someone demanded. Madison looked each one in the eye. "Because it's true. Because the wild is bigger than our theories. And because stories like Thunder's deserve to be heard." As she packed up, Dr. Harlan found her and squeezed her shoulder. "Proud of you, Madison. No matter what happens." The rest of the day passed in a blur of panels and conversations, some supportive, others dismissive. Madison felt the tension knotting in her shoulders, but she also felt a surge of defiance. She had stood her ground, spoken for the wild, refused to be intimidated by reputation or politics. That evening, alone in her hotel room, Madison replayed the footage once more. She wrote in her journal, "Today I stood before the world, and I did not flinch. The truth is out there now, wild and unbroken. Whatever comes next, I know I did the right thing." She looked out the window, across the city lights to the distant shadow of mountains. Somewhere out there, Thunder led his herd under the open sky, forever unbound. Madison knew her own fight was just beginning, but she welcomed it. For Thunder, for science, for the wild. In the weeks following the conference, Madison's world felt like it had been turned upside down. The footage of Thunder's leap had spread through scientific circles like wildfire, igniting fierce debates online and in meeting rooms. Some lauded her courage and the significance of her discovery, but just as many dismissed it, calling it a trick of the camera, a statistical outlier, or a desperate play for attention. For every email of encouragement, there were two more questioning her integrity, her motives, her place in the field. But that was nothing compared to what awaited her back in Wyoming. As news of Thunder's leap rippled through the region, local ranchers and reporters took an unexpected interest. The wild Mustangs were no longer just Madison's obsession. They'd become a lightning rod for old grudges, local gossip, and the simmering debate over who really belonged in these mountains. It began one hot afternoon as Madison returned from checking her remote camera traps. Dust coated her boots and sweat plastered her hair to her forehead as she trudged into town for supplies. As she loaded groceries into her truck, a voice called out across the parking lot. "You that horse scientist everyone's talking about?" The speaker was Mr. Rourke, a broad-shouldered rancher with a reputation for stubbornness. His face was weathered and his hands were rough, the kind of man who'd spent a lifetime outdoors. "That's me," Madison answered, wary. Rourke strode closer, anger in every step. "I seen your story on the news about that black stallion. Let me tell you something. The only thing wild horses ever done for this county is make trouble, tear up fences, run off with our stock, leave the land a mess. And now you're making them into celebrities?" Madison set her groceries down, meeting his glare. "I'm just sharing what I observed. Wild horses are part of the ecosystem, Mr. Rourke. They belong here." He snorted. "That's not what my family thinks, or my neighbors. Last month, 3 calves went missing. Guess who gets blamed? The Mustangs. My patience is running out." A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the tension. Madison felt their eyes on her, the weight of their doubts pressing down. She'd known this might happen, but standing alone in the dusty parking lot, she realized how far her story had traveled and how much was at stake. "I'm not here to make enemies," she said, voice steady. But I won't ignore what I've seen either. These horses aren't villains. They're survivors. Rourke shook his head and stomped away, muttering under his breath. The onlookers dispersed, leaving Madison with a mix of anger and sadness swirling inside her. Every step forward seemed to bring new resistance, new battle lines. That night, unable to sleep, Madison hiked out to check her camera traps again, seeking solace in the moonlit wild. She trekked through tangled brush and over rocky slopes, flashlight beam dancing ahead. Her boots snapped twigs, sending startled rabbits darting for cover. The world was hushed, every sound magnified in the darkness. When she reached the last trap, a motion-triggered camera set by the river's edge, she paused, watching the little red light blink. She swapped memory cards, then scanned the bank with her flashlight. That's when she saw it. A small, trembling Mustang foal, barely a year old, stranded on a gravel bar in the rushing river. Madison's heart leapt. The foal's legs shook as it fought to stay upright, water swirling up to its knees, eyes wide with terror. The herd was nowhere in sight, and the river's current looked strong enough to sweep a grown man away. Madison hesitated only a moment, then splashed into the icy water, boots filling as she waded toward the foal. "Easy, easy," she whispered, arms outstretched, voice soft. The foal sidestepped, nearly slipping, panic sparking in its dark eyes. Madison inched closer, cold numbing her legs, until she was within reach. She grabbed the foal's mane gently, steadying it, then guided it back toward the shore, fighting the current every step. By the time they made it to dry land, Madison was soaked and shivering, her breath coming in ragged bursts. She knelt beside the foal, stroking its neck, feeling its rapid heartbeat through her palm. It was Thunder's offspring. She recognized the blaze of white on its face, the defiant spark in its eyes. Slowly, she coaxed the foal back toward the safety of the brush, where the rest of the herd would eventually find it. When she was sure the little Mustang was safe, Madison collapsed onto a boulder, hugging her knees, shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion. The incident was caught on the camera trap, every moment recorded, from the foal's desperate struggle to Madison's rescue. When the footage surfaced online, it exploded. Some called her a hero. Others accused her of meddling with nature, of crossing the line between observer and participant. A new debate erupted, one that pitted science against emotion, conservation against tradition. Ranchers like Rourke fumed. Environmentalists rallied to Madison's defense. Talk radio hosts took calls from angry locals and passionate horse lovers alike. Even in town, the subject was unavoidable. At the cafe, at the post office, on the sidewalk, everyone seemed to have an opinion. Madison stood firm. "Sometimes, being a scientist means making hard choices," she said in interviews. "I couldn't let that foal drown. Science is about observation, yes, but it's also about responsibility." Through it all, Madison's bond with the Mustang herd deepened. She saw them not just as subjects, but as fellow travelers, struggling, adapting, surviving. She grew more protective, more invested. The wild had marked her, claimed her, and she would fight for it, no matter how fierce the opposition became. Late one evening, as a storm rolled in over the mountains, Madison sat by her campfire, watching lightning flicker across the sky. In the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of Thunder, leading his herd across a ridge, strong, wild, and for now, free. She made a silent promise, staring into the flames. "I'll keep telling your story. I'll stand with you, no matter what comes next." And in the crackle of the fire, the howl of the wind, Madison felt her resolve harden into something unbreakable. The fight had just begun, but she was ready. Madison never expected her research to become headline news, Yet within days of the foal's rescue, the video, grainy, raw, water splashing as she fought the river's current, was everywhere. At first, it started as a local story, the kind that made the rounds in Wyoming. Wildlife biologist rescues Mustang foal from raging river. A local reporter interviewed her in front of the post office, camera crew standing awkwardly by the row of battered mailboxes. But it didn't stop there. By the time Madison returned to her camp that night, her phone was buzzing with calls and texts. The clip had gone viral, racking up tens of thousands of views on social media. News outlets from across the country started reaching out. First Denver, then Chicago, then New York and LA. People debated in the comments, shared the footage, and turned her quiet, lonely fieldwork into a lightning rod for controversy. Her inbox was flooded. Half the messages were supportive. "You're a hero! Thank you for saving that little Mustang. I wish there were more scientists like you," but the other half stung like salt on an open wound. "You're interfering with nature. That's not science. It's showboating. Stay out of it and let the herd do what they do." Some accused her of putting herself and the animals at risk for fame. A few were downright threatening. "If those Mustangs ruin another season for ranchers, it's on you." Madison stopped reading after the first few late-night rants. The national media soon came calling. Producers from major networks wanted her on their morning shows. A documentary filmmaker showed up at her camp, eager to record the wild Mustang lady in action. At first, Madison refused. She didn't want the circus. She wanted science. But the pressure mounted. Her university called, urging her to use this attention to promote their research and funding. She finally agreed to appear on a popular morning show, joining via video call. Sitting on a log with the Wind River Range behind her, Madison faced the host's questions, some thoughtful, some sensational. "What made you jump into that river? Are wild horses really as intelligent as your footage suggests? Do you worry about your safety, about your reputation?" She answered carefully, always trying to steer the conversation back to the science, to thunder and the wild herd. But it didn't matter. The internet did what it always does, twisted everything into memes, arguments, and trending hashtags. #Mustang Madison and #Thunderleap exploded across social feeds. Some viewers urged her to sell her footage to major corporations or streaming services. Others demanded she release the exact GPS coordinates so real horse lovers could see the herd for themselves. Conservationists begged her to lobby for stronger protections. Critics raged that she was inviting more danger, more interference, more human intrusion. Reporters camped outside the trailhead, hoping for a shot of Thunder's band or the famous Black Stallion. One day, Madison returned to camp to find 3 strangers on ATVs, scanning the hills with binoculars. "We're just here for a look," they insisted. Madison's temper flared. "You're trespassing. These horses need space. Respect that." As the weeks passed, she realized she'd lost something precious: her solitude. The silence of the mountains was now broken by the buzz of drones, the growl of off-road vehicles, and the click of camera shutters. Even her research suffered. Thunder and his herd became warier, often slipping away at the first sign of people. The foals hid behind their mothers, the stallion always placing himself between his band and the new threat. Madison withdrew, refusing interviews and public appearances. She posted statements online, pleading for restraint. "Please do not seek out the Mustangs. They are wild creatures who deserve their freedom and their safety." She partnered with a local conservation group, working to create buffer zones and limit access to key areas. But the noise only grew. Petitions demanding government action flooded local offices. Environmentalists and animal lovers wanted new laws to protect the horses and their range. Ranchers, feeling threatened, pushed back harder, blaming Madison for inviting disaster. Her relationship with Mr. Rourke reached a new low after a local talk radio show aired his angry interview. "She's bringing every city fool and camera-happy tourist to my backyard. My cattle can't compete with viral Mustangs." Madison tried to shield the herd from the attention, moving her camp farther into the backcountry, working at night, and setting up cameras in secret. She watched, with growing sadness, as the wild horses grew more skittish. She saw Thunder, scars fresh on his flank, head high, nostrils flaring at the sound of distant engines. Even Willow, the steady gray mare, stayed close to the thicket, her foals barely venturing out. The fame, the offers, the arguments, it all became a burden she never wanted. Madison found herself longing for the first days in the wild, when her only company was the wind, the stars, and the silent bond between her and the Mustangs. Now she felt responsible for every consequence, every disturbance, every change. Late one evening, as another viral headline flashed on her phone, Madison stared up at the stars and made a decision. She declined all offers for exclusive footage. She refused to partner with the networks or tech companies waving money in her face. She donated her video to a nonprofit wild horse advocacy group, with one condition: they would use it only to promote Mustang safety and habitat conservation, not for profit, not for spectacle. Her inbox quieted. Some fans called her ungrateful. A few investors withdrew their support. But Madison didn't care. For her, the Mustangs came first. Their safety, their freedom, their wildness. She knew the cost of fame was high, but her loyalty would always be to the herd, not to the spotlight. And in the hush of the pre-dawn hours, she watched Thunder lead his battered, wary band into the mists of the valley, living proof that some things were still untamed, still true, and still worth fighting for. The viral storm had left its mark, but from the ashes, something new began to take root. Madison noticed it first in the tone of the emails she received. Where once there had been outrage and disbelief, now came messages of curiosity and support. Teachers wanting lesson plans, students begging for Zoom calls, families thanking her for inspiring their kids. Her story and Thunder's had moved people, but even more astonishing, it had begun to move institutions. One morning, Madison awoke in her tent to a new alert on her phone, an official request from the Department of Interior. They wanted her to share her raw data with a task force examining wild horse policy. Days later, her inbox pinged again, this time an invitation from a group of scientists hoping to replicate her findings on Mustang leadership and intelligence. The ripple effect of her work was spreading, and the world was finally taking notice. It wasn't just scientists who were changing. News of Thunder's leap and the foal's rescue had sparked a wave of grassroots activism. Petitions for new wild horse protections gained thousands of signatures. Social media campaigns flooded state representatives with calls to safeguard the Mustang's range. Lawmakers, feeling the public pressure, announced a new bill to expand the protected territory in the Wind River Range, making it harder for ranchers or developers to encroach on Mustang land. Even Mr. Rourke, the grizzled rancher who had once confronted Madison in the parking lot, found himself facing unexpected change. He was in his barn, repairing a gate, when his young granddaughter Ellie came running in, waving a picture she'd drawn. It was a black stallion, bold and wild, with the words "Thunder the Brave" scrawled underneath. "Grandpa, can we go see the wild horses?" she asked, eyes wide with hope. Rourke hesitated, looking at her drawing, then at her shining face. The old anger softened just a bit. He remembered being a boy and watching the Mustangs run across the valley, before fences, before arguments, before the world got so complicated. That afternoon, he drove Ellie out to a quiet overlook above the range. They watched as Thunder's herd grazed in the golden light, the stallion keeping careful watch over his band. Ellie squeezed her grandpa's hand. "They're beautiful," she whispered. Rourke nodded, seeing them through her eyes. Majestic, fragile, and undeniably a part of this land. For the first time, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe Madison had been right all along. The next week, Rourke surprised Madison at her camp. He arrived unannounced, boots crunching in the dirt. Madison straightened, wary, but he raised a calloused hand. "Came to talk," he said. "Been doing some thinking. My Ellie, she loves those horses. Maybe it's time we find a way to work together instead of butting heads." They sat by the fire, awkward at first, then warming to the conversation. Rourke shared stories about the land, the old days, and the delicate balance between cattle and wild creatures. Madison listened, surprised by his candor. She explained her research in plain language, why the Mustangs mattered, not just for science, but for Wyoming's identity and the dreams of the next generation. To her shock, Rourke offered a proposal. "I know the land better than anyone. If we can set boundaries, safe spots for the horses, good pasture for the cattle, maybe we keep the peace. And maybe I help keep folks away from Thunder's herd, at least during foaling season." A handshake sealed the deal. News of their partnership spread quickly. Madison and Rourke became unlikely allies, working with conservationists and ranchers to mark out new buffer zones and educate visitors. School groups toured the Mustang Range, led by Madison and sometimes Ellie, who had become the herd's unofficial ambassador. The story reached even further. Thunder's Leap became the centerpiece of a new documentary on animal intelligence, narrated by a famous actor. Classroom curriculums across the state featured the stallion who jumped, encouraging kids to ask questions about leadership, bravery, and the natural world. Thunder's herd was no longer a source of conflict, but a symbol of resilience and hope. Madison's work inspired other scientists. Researchers from Montana and Nevada launched their own studies, comparing notes with her about herd leadership and survival strategies. The new legislation passed the State House with bipartisan support, enshrining stronger protections for wild horses and securing funding for continued research. Amid all the excitement, Madison was invited to lead a new, collaborative initiative, the Wild Horse Adaptation Project, bringing together biologists, ranchers, and local leaders to develop long-term conservation plans. She accepted with pride and humility, aware that her journey had only just begun. Late one evening, as the first snow dusted the peaks, Madison found herself standing at the edge of Thunder's Valley. The air was crisp, her breath curling white. Below, Thunder grazed. His scars faded, but his spirit undiminished, surrounded by mares and foals. The landscape, once a battleground, now felt like a promise, a future shaped by courage, cooperation, and the willingness to leap. As stars blinked awake overhead, Madison thought about everything that had changed. She thought about the risks, the doubts, the lonely nights in her tent. She remembered Thunder's impossible leap, the moment that had started it all. She smiled, feeling the weight of hope. The world was listening, learning, growing. And because of one wild stallion and the scientist who refused to back down, a new chapter was opening for the Wind River Mustangs and all who called this land home. For the first time, Madison allowed herself to dream not just of survival, but of legacy, of a story that would echo through generations, wild and free as Thunder himself. The last leaves of autumn clung stubbornly to the cottonwoods along the river, as Madison hiked back to the cliff where Thunder had made his impossible leap. The air was crisp, the sky endless and blue, the mountains dusted with the season's first snow. Every footstep crunched on frost and loose stone, echoing in the stillness. She carried nothing but her old journal, a battered thermos of coffee, and the weight of everything that had changed since that fateful morning. She paused at the edge, wind tugging her hair, and looked down into the ravine where white water roared over ancient rocks. The memory was as sharp as ever. Thunder's wild eyes, the thunder of hooves, the dizzying drop, the raw gamble of survival. She knelt and brushed her fingers over the cold, rough ground, tracing the outline of his hoofprints still visible in her mind. A single choice, she thought, can ripple through everything, changing the course of lives, of communities, even of the land itself. Madison opened her journal and began to write, trying to capture what she felt in this sacred, wild place. We come to the edge believing we understand the rules, the limits, the boundaries of what's possible. Then something or someone leaps, and everything shifts. Her thoughts wandered to Thunder. He'd become a legend now, his story told in classrooms, at kitchen tables, in newspaper headlines, and conservation summits. The image of his leap, the courage, the intelligence, the refusal to give up, had changed minds and hearts. Kids drew pictures of him. Adults whispered about his resilience. Even ranchers like Rourke had begun to see wild horses not as a nuisance but as neighbors. A single act of survival had started a movement. But the lesson was deeper than that. Madison realized it as she gazed across the valley. Thunder had leapt not because he was reckless, but because he understood that sometimes the only way forward is through the unknown. Instinct, intelligence, courage, they had all converged in that desperate moment. It was a lesson for Mustangs, for scientists, for anyone who dared to challenge the status quo. She thought about her own journey, the fear she'd felt, of failure, of ridicule, of being dismissed by her peers, the temptation to give up when the voices grew too loud, the pressure too much. But she'd persisted, and her persistence had sparked change. New laws, new alliances, new hope for the future of the wild. A crow soared overhead, its cry breaking the silence. Madison smiled, remembering the many small failures and stumbles along the way. The nights she'd spent shivering in her tent, doubting herself, wondering if she was truly making a difference. The mistakes in her fieldwork, the missed opportunities, the moments of heartbreak when the herd was scattered, or the wolves claimed a foal. She wrote, "Progress is never clean, never easy. It's messy, loud, uncertain. It's built on mistakes as much as on triumphs." She stood and walked along the rim, recalling the faces of those she'd met. Ellie and her wide-eyed wonder, Rourke with his grudging respect, Dr. Harlan's guarded encouragement, her fellow scientists who had finally begun to listen. She saw, in her mind's eye, a line of young girls and boys at a school assembly, raising their hands, full of questions about wild horses and the power of brave choices. A teacher had invited Madison to speak at the local elementary school. She'd stood before rows of eager faces, telling Thunder's story, showing her video, explaining how sometimes the scariest leap is the one that changes everything. "Don't let anyone tell you what you can't do," she'd said, voice firm but gentle. "Don't be afraid to leap, whether you're chasing a dream, solving a problem, or standing up for what you believe is right." The questions had poured in. Were you scared? Did you want to quit? "What happened to the baby horse?" Madison answered honestly. "Yes, I was scared. Yes, I thought about quitting. And the baby horse? He grew strong, and he's still running wild with Thunder's herd. After the talk, a shy girl slipped her a note. "I want to be brave like you, and like Thunder." Madison tucked it into her journal, heart swelling with pride and humility. Back on the cliff, she looked out over the wild country, sunlight gleaming on the river. She took out her pen, writing the final words of her field essay. What animals teach us is not just about survival. It's about leadership, about community, about the ripple effect of bravery. Thunder leapt not just for himself, but for his herd. We too shape the world by the choices we make, especially when we leap into the unknown. The wind whipped around her, scattering leaves. Madison stood tall, feeling the ground solid beneath her boots, the sky wide above. She understood, now more than ever, that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was moving forward in spite of it, trusting yourself, your instincts, your hope. On her way back, she stopped by the edge of the valley, watching Thunder graze with his herd. The black stallion glanced up, nostrils flaring, mane tossing in the breeze. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance, a silent exchange, recognition between survivors, between those who had dared the leap and found a new world on the other side. As the sun set, Madison promised herself to keep telling their story, to keep leaping for the wild, for the future, for every kid who needed to know that courage could change the world. Her essay would be published in scientific journals and read in classrooms, sparking conversations about animal intelligence, leadership, and the value of taking risks. But for Madison, the real reward was here, at the edge of the world, where a single brave act could echo forever across the wild Wyoming land. The years slipped by, but the story of Thunder's leap only grew stronger. It lived on in the rustle of prairie grass, the wind's low whistle, and the beating hearts of those who dared to imagine something wilder and braver than what they'd been told was possible. For Madison Lee, everything had changed. The world she moved through now was more open, more curious, more willing to believe. Not just in Mustangs, but in the courage that runs through all living things. Thunder himself became a legend. Among the wild herds of the Wind River Range, other stallions adopted new tactics, leading their bands along cliff paths, learning to cross rivers in daring ways, testing the boundaries of old trails. Biologists documented these changes, calling it the Thunder effect. Young Mustangs mimicked their leaders' behaviors, and the herd's survival rate rose. Where once brute force decided a stallion's fate, now cleverness and adaptability mattered just as much. But the changes went further. Madison's work transformed how the public saw wild Mustangs. She was no longer just that horse lady from Wyoming. She was a pioneer, featured in documentaries and educational specials. Her footage of Thunder's leap shown in classrooms from coast to coast. Every year, the town near the range hosted the Wild Horse Festival. Families and scientists gathered to celebrate the Mustangs. Art contests, trail hikes, school bands playing songs inspired by Thunder's story. Madison often stood at the festival's edge, watching the next generation race stick-horse Mustangs through obstacle courses, their laughter ringing out under banners that read, "Leap into the Wild." It wasn't just fun and games. The local high school started a mentorship program, pairing students interested in biology with professional researchers. Girls and boys who once thought science was out of reach now held notebooks and cameras, asking questions in the field. Many pointed to Madison's story and to Thunder as the reason they wanted to learn, to care, to push boundaries. There were harder days, too. The fight for conservation never truly ended. Ranchers still grumbled about fences and grazing rights. Developers eyed the valleys for new roads and resorts. Sometimes the debates grew heated in town meetings or online forums. But now there was a stronger coalition, locals and outsiders, ranchers and environmentalists, who stood up together for the wild horses and their land. The difference was that now, people listened. Madison led new research initiatives, collaborating with scientists from around the world. Her team discovered more about Mustang communication, family structure, and migration routes, knowledge that shaped policy and inspired new protections. She published essays about leadership, risk, and the lessons animals teach us about adapting to a changing world. Thunder's Leap had set the template, not just for Mustangs, but for everyone watching, everyone brave enough to leap. One evening, after a long day tracking the herd, Madison stood with a group of young scientists at the overlook above the valley. The sky burned with sunset colors, and the herds grazed far below, safe and wild. Thunder, older now but still unmistakable, guided his band along the ridge. His foals, his legacy, kicked and played at his side. A young woman beside Madison whispered, "Do you ever wonder if it would have happened without you being here?" Madison smiled, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening with years of sun and wind. "Maybe it would have, maybe not," she said. "But that's the thing about the wild. Sometimes you just have to trust and leap and see where it takes you." She remembered all the nights alone in her tent, the doubts, the mockery, the disbelief, the feeling of standing at the edge, career, reputation, everything she believed in, knowing one wrong step could send her dreams crashing. She thought of Thunder, battered and bleeding, choosing the leap no one thought possible. The wild teaches you, she thought, that change is never safe, never easy. But the leap, when it comes, can echo farther than you'll ever know. As the stars appeared and the scientists packed up their gear, Madison lingered a while, watching Thunder lead his herd through shadows and light. In that moment, the years melted away. She saw herself, young and uncertain, crouched behind her camera, breath held as Thunder ran for his life. She saw Ellie, Rourke's granddaughter, now a teenager volunteering with wildlife groups, her sketchbooks full of horses and hope. She saw classrooms full of kids, teachers, ranchers, and scientists, each touched in some way by the story of the leap. At the final Wild Horse Festival of the season, Madison was invited to speak. She stood on the small stage, microphone in hand, Thunder's image projected behind her. She looked out at the crowd, faces familiar and new, eyes bright with expectation. "I came here years ago to study wild horses," she began, her voice steady. "But what I learned was bigger than any one animal, any one person. I learned that bravery isn't about not being afraid. It's about facing the unknown, about leaping even when you can't see what's on the other side. Thunder taught me that. And you, this community, proved it true." She paused, letting the words settle. "We are all the sum of our leaps. The risks we take, the kindness we show, the dreams we dare to chase. If we want a future for these wild herds, for the land, for our children, we have to keep leaping, together." The crowd erupted in applause. Madison's chest tightened, not with nerves, but with gratitude. She knew this was only the beginning. Thunder's legacy was not just survival, but transformation, of land, of hearts, of possibility. As dusk settled and music drifted over the festival grounds, Madison walked down to the valley, alone. The Mustangs were silhouettes in the twilight, strong and wild as ever. She stood with them until the first stars blinked overhead, breathing in the promise of the open sky. The leap had changed everything, and in its echo, Madison found her true place, forever a part of the wild, forever running with Thunder, forever leaping into hope.